Teresa Williams sat quietly in the corner of the crowded airport terminal, her worn canvas bag resting on her lap like a sleeping cat. At 30 years old, she had learned to blend into crowds, to become invisible when the world got too loud. Her gentle brown eyes held stories that most people would never guess, and her soft voice rarely rose above a whisper. The flight from Denver to Chicago had been delayed for 3 hours, and the waiting area buzzed with frustrated travelers. Children cried while their parents paced back and forth. Business people tapped angrily on their phones, and elderly couples sat holding hands, patient as always. Teresa watched it all with the calm of someone who had seen much worse than a delayed flight. She wore simple clothes, faded jeans, and a plain blue sweater that had seen better days. Her sneakers were old but clean, and her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anyone special. She looked like any other traveler trying to get home after a long trip. But Teresa carried something precious in her bag, something that meant more to her than all the money in the world. It was folded carefully between her other clothes, wrapped in tissue paper like a treasure. She had been carrying it with her for weeks now, unable to leave it behind, unable to let it go. The announcement came over the loudspeaker, crackling with static. Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 447 to Chicago will be delayed an additional 2 hours due to mechanical issues. We apologize for the inconvenience. A collective groan rose from the waiting passengers. A tall man in an expensive suit slammed his briefcase down on a nearby chair. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "I have a meeting in the morning." His name was Richard Brennan, and he owned 3 car dealerships in the wealthy suburb of Ashford Heights. He was used to getting his way, used to people jumping when he snapped his fingers. The delay was ruining his carefully planned schedule, and he was looking for someone to blame. Standing next to him was his business partner, David Walsh. David wore a watch that cost more than most people made in a month, and his shoes were polished to mirror brightness. He owned several restaurants downtown and prided himself on never taking no for an answer. "For hours we've been sitting here," David complained, his voice carrying across the terminal. "This is what happens when you fly with budget airlines." Teresa glanced up from her book, catching sight of the 2 men. She recognized their type immediately, the kind of people who believed their money made them more important than everyone else. She had dealt with their kind before, and she knew it was best to stay out of their way. But staying out of their way became impossible when Richard's eyes landed on her corner seat. "Excuse me," he said, walking over with David close behind. "We need these seats. We're Gold members, and this is the business section." Teresa looked around confused. There were no signs marking any special section, and the seats were first come, first served. "I'm sorry, but I don't think Dash—" "Look, lady," David interrupted. "We don't have time for arguments. We have important calls to make, and we need the quiet space. Why don't you find somewhere else to sit?" Other passengers began to notice the commotion. A few people pulled out their phones, sensing drama was about to unfold. Teresa felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as more eyes turned toward her corner. "There are plenty of other seats," she said quietly, gesturing toward the rows of empty chairs throughout the terminal. "I've been sitting here for hours." Richard's face reddened. "Do you know who we are? I own Brennan Motors. Maybe you've seen our commercials? We spend thousands of dollars on flights every month. What do you spend? $50 on a discount ticket." Teresa's grip tightened on her bag. Something about the way Richard spoke, the way he looked at her like she was garbage, reminded her of painful memories she tried to keep buried. Her heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not causing any trouble," she said. "I just want to wait for my flight in peace." "Peace?" David laughed coldly. "You want peace? Then move somewhere else. This is what happens when airlines let just anyone buy tickets. The quality of passengers keeps getting worse." The crowd around them grew larger. People stopped scrolling through their phones to watch the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one stepped forward to help Teresa. They just watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Richard leaned closer to Teresa, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Listen carefully. We're going to count to 10. If you're not out of these seats by then, we're going to make sure everyone in this terminal knows exactly what kind of person you really are." Teresa's hands trembled slightly as she held her bag closer to her chest. Inside that bag was something sacred, something that represented everything she had fought for and lost. She couldn't let these men see her fear, couldn't let them win. 1, Richard began counting, his voice growing louder so everyone could hear. 2, 3. The terminal fell silent except for the sound of his counting. Even the crying children seemed to pause, sensing the tension in the air. 4, 5, 6. Teresa stood up slowly, her legs shaking. She had faced down dangerous enemies in places these men couldn't even imagine. But something about this public humiliation cut deeper than any physical threat ever could. 7, 8. As she reached for her bag, the strap caught on the arm of the chair. She tugged gently, trying to free it without drawing more attention. 9. The strap pulled tighter, and Teresa felt panic rising in her chest. She couldn't let them see what was in her bag. She couldn't let them touch it with their cruel hands. 10. Richard's smile was vicious as he reached for Teresa's bag. "Time's up, lady. Let's see what's so important that you couldn't just move when we asked nicely." He grabbed the bag from her hands and held it high above his head like a trophy. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording every moment. Teresa's eyes widened in horror as she realized what was about to happen. "Please," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the noise of the growing crowd. Richard's fingers found the zipper, and with one swift motion he pulled it open. The contents of Teresa's bag spilled out across the terminal floor, like scattered pieces of her soul. Teresa's belongings scattered across the cold terminal floor like autumn leaves in a violent wind. Her few clothes tumbled out first, a couple of worn t-shirts, an old pair of jeans, and some undergarments that made the crowd snicker and point. A small toiletry bag burst open, sending a travel-sized shampoo bottle rolling toward someone's feet. Richard and David burst into laughter, their voices echoing through the terminal. "Look at this," Richard announced to the crowd, kicking at Teresa's scattered belongings. "This is what passes for luggage these days. I spend more on lunch than she probably spends on clothes in a year." Teresa dropped to her knees, desperately trying to gather her things while the crowd watched and recorded. Her cheeks burned with shame as strangers laughed at her simple possessions. She could hear whispers and comments from the people around her, each word cutting deeper than the last. "How embarrassing," someone muttered. "Why doesn't she just leave?" another voice asked. "This is why I fly first class," a woman in expensive jewelry said loudly enough for everyone to hear. But Teresa barely heard them. Her eyes were frantically searching the scattered items, looking for one thing in particular. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for each piece of clothing, checking underneath and around every item. David picked up one of her t-shirts with 2 fingers, holding it away from his body like it might contaminate him. "Look at this rag," he said, showing it to the crowd. "It's got holes in it. Don't they have standards for who can fly anymore?" Teresa's hands shook as she continued gathering her things. Where was it? It had to be here somewhere. She had packed it so carefully, wrapped it in tissue paper, and placed it in the very center of her bag for protection. "Please," she whispered to Richard, "just let me get my things and go." "Oh, we're not done yet," Richard said with a cruel smile. "You wanted to keep your seat so badly, so now everyone gets to see why you thought you were so special." He bent down and picked up what looked like a bundle of tissue paper that had been protecting something inside. Teresa's blood turned to ice as she realized what he was holding. "What's this?" Richard asked, beginning to unwrap the tissue paper. "Did you bring your lunch?" "Some kind of souvenir from your vacation." No, please don't dash. Teresa reached for the bundle, but David stepped between them, blocking her path. Let's see what's so precious that you wrapped it up like a present, David said, encouraging Richard to continue. The crowd pressed closer, their phones still recording. Teresa felt like she was drowning in a sea of curious faces and judgmental stares. She had survived combat zones, had faced down enemies with weapons, but this public humiliation was breaking her in ways she never expected. Richard's fingers worked at the tissue paper, peeling it away layer by layer. Teresa watched in horror, knowing that in seconds, the most sacred thing in her life would be exposed to these cruel strangers. It's some kind of fabric, Richard announced, pulling away more tissue paper. Looks like clothing, maybe? Teresa's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She had carried that precious bundle for 2 months, ever since the funeral. It was all she had left of him, all she had left of the life she used to live before everything changed. The tissue paper fell away completely, and Richard held up what was inside for everyone to see. For a moment, the terminal fell completely silent. Even the background noise of the airport seemed to fade away. Richard's smile faltered as he realized he wasn't holding an ordinary piece of clothing. The fabric was thick and durable, with a specific pattern and color that anyone would recognize. There were patches sewn onto it, insignia that meant something important. Is that? David started to say, but his voice trailed off. Teresa slowly stood up, her eyes never leaving the uniform in Richard's hands. The crowd around them began to murmur, some people recognizing what they were seeing, others still confused but sensing that something had shifted in the air. An elderly man near the back of the crowd stepped forward, his own face pale. Son, he said to Richard, do you know what you're holding? Richard looked down at the uniform again, his confident expression beginning to crack. The patches and insignia were becoming clearer now, and even someone as self-absorbed as him could start to understand their significance. Teresa's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady despite the tears in her eyes. That uniform, she said quietly, belonged to my husband. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. People began to back away slightly, as if they suddenly realized they had been watching something they shouldn't have seen. My husband, Teresa continued, Sergeant Michael Williams. He served 3 tours overseas before he... She couldn't finish the sentence. Richard's hands began to shake as he held the uniform. The patches were clear now, military insignia, medals, ranks that told the story of a soldier's service. This wasn't just any piece of clothing. This was a memorial, a sacred remembrance of someone who had given everything for his country. David took a step back, his expensive watch suddenly feeling heavy on his wrist. Richard, he whispered, we need to dash. But before he could finish a sentence, a new voice cut through the crowd. What's going on here? Everyone turned to see an airport security officer approaching, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. Behind him walked a man in a military dress uniform, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke of years of distinguished service. The military officer's eyes immediately found the uniform in Richard's hands, and his face hardened like stone. Sir, he said in a voice that could command armies, I'm going to need you to very carefully hand me that uniform. Richard's face went from red to white in seconds. His hands trembled as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. The crowd around them had grown to over 50 people, all watching, all recording, all witnessing what was about to become the biggest mistake of his life. The military officer stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. That uniform, he said slowly, belongs to a fallen hero, and if you've desecrated it in any way, son, you're going to answer to me. Teresa stood frozen, watching as the 2 men who had humiliated her just moments ago began to understand the true weight of their actions. But this was only the beginning. The real reckoning was still to come. Airport security began pushing through the crowd, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Someone had called this in as a potential incident involving military property, and now half the airport's security force was converging on their location. Richard's expensive suit suddenly felt like a costume, his wealth and status meaningless in the face of what he had done. He looked at Teresa with new eyes, seeing her not as a nobody to be pushed around, but as a grieving widow whose most precious possession he had violated. The military officer reached out his hand. "The uniform, sir." "Now." As Richard extended his shaking hands to return the uniform, the crowd began to realize they were witnessing something that would change everything. The quiet woman they had watched get humiliated wasn't just anyone. She was a Gold Star wife, and her story was about to turn their world upside down. Colonel James Harrison took the uniform from Richard's trembling hands with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic. His weathered fingers traced the name tape, Williams, and his jaw tightened as he read the patches and medals sewn into the fabric. "Purple Heart," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent terminal. "Bronze Star with V device for valor. Combat Infantry badge." He looked up at Teresa, his eyes filled with respect. "Your husband was a hero, ma'am." Teresa nodded, unable to speak as she watched the colonel carefully refold the uniform. The crowd around them had grown to over 100 people, with more arriving every minute. Word was spreading through the terminal like wildfire. Someone had desecrated a fallen soldier's uniform. Richard stood frozen, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat. The confident businessman who had bullied Teresa just minutes ago looked like a scared child. David had backed away completely, trying to disappear into the crowd, but people were already pointing him out to security. "Ma'am," Colonel Harrison said to Teresa, "I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what happened here." Teresa's voice was steady now, strengthened by the presence of someone who understood the significance of what she carried. "I was sitting quietly waiting for my flight. These two men demanded my seat, said they were more important than me. When I didn't move fast enough, they grabbed my bag and emptied it in front of everyone." She gestured toward her scattered belongings, still spread across the floor. "They laughed at my clothes, called me names, said I didn't belong here. Then they found my husband's uniform." The colonel's face darkened with each word. He had served for 30 years, had seen combat in 3 different wars, and had buried too many good soldiers. The thought of anyone treating a Gold Star family with such disrespect filled him with a cold fury. "Sir," he said to Richard, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "do you understand what you've done?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The crowd pressed closer, their phones capturing every moment of his humiliation. Someone had already started a live stream, and the video was being shared across social media platforms faster than airport security could contain it. Airport security Captain Maria Santos pushed through the crowd, her radio crackling with updates. "We have news crews arriving at the main entrance," she announced. "This is going viral online. The whole country is going to see this." She looked at Richard and David with disgust. "Gentlemen, you're going to need to come with me. We have some serious questions to ask you." David finally found his voice. "Look, we didn't know. How were we supposed to know she was military? She looked like any other passenger." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. "That's the point, you idiot!" someone yelled. "You don't treat anyone like that." "Gold Star families deserve respect," another voice added. An elderly woman pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "My son served in Afghanistan," she said, her voice breaking. "He came home, but so many didn't. How dare you treat this woman like garbage?" More voices joined in, telling their own stories of military service, of sons and daughters who had served, of families who had sacrificed everything for their country. The crowd's anger was building like a storm, and Richard and David found themselves at the center of it. Teresa watched in amazement as strangers rallied to her defense. For months after Michael's death, she had felt invisible, forgotten by a world that had moved on while she remained trapped in her grief. Now, suddenly, she was surrounded by people who understood her pain. Colonel Harrison handed her the carefully folded uniform. "This belongs with you," he said gently, "and I want you to know that your husband's sacrifice meant something. It will always mean something." A reporter from the local news station pushed through the crowd, her camera crew close behind. "Are you Teresa Williams?" she asked breathlessly. "The widow of Sergeant Michael Williams, who was killed in action 6 months ago." Teresa nodded, clutching the uniform to her chest. "Ma'am," the reporter continued, "this video has already been viewed over 500,000 times. People are calling for justice. They want to know how 2 grown men could treat a Gold Star widow with such cruelty." Richard tried to push past the crowd, but security officers blocked his path. "I need to get to my flight," he said desperately. "This is all a misunderstanding." "The only place you're going," Captain Santos said firmly, "is to our security office. We have some calls to make." She turned to the crowd. "I need everyone to step back and give Mrs. Williams some space. This is still an active investigation." But the crowd wasn't backing down. Someone had pulled up Richard's business information online and was reading it aloud. Richard Brennan, owner of Brennan Motors in Ashford Heights. 3 locations, been in business for 15 years. David Walsh, another voice added, owner of Walsh Restaurant Group. 5 restaurants downtown. The information spread through the crowd like wildfire. People were already pulling out their phones to leave negative reviews, to share the story with their friends, to make sure the whole world knew what these men had done. Teresa felt overwhelmed by the support, but also exhausted by the attention. All she had wanted was to fly home quietly, to visit Michael's grave on what would have been their wedding anniversary. Instead, she found herself at the center of a national story about respect, dignity, and the price of cruelty. Colonel Harrison noticed her distress and moved to shield her from the cameras. "Mrs. Williams needs some privacy," he announced. "This has been traumatic enough." But as they tried to move through the crowd, a new commotion erupted near the security checkpoint. A group of uniformed soldiers was approaching, their faces grim with determination. "Those are Marines from the local recruiting station," someone in the crowd whispered. "They must have seen the video." The Marines moved through the crowd with military precision, their dress blue uniforms pristine and their bearing proud. They formed a protective circle around Teresa, their presence sending a clear message to everyone watching. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior Marine, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said with deep respect, "we heard what happened. We're here to make sure you get home safely." Teresa looked around at the faces surrounding her, the colonel, the Marines, the crowd of strangers who had become her unexpected army. For the first time since Michael's death, she didn't feel alone. But this was far from over. Outside the terminal, news vans were arriving, protesters were gathering, and the phones at Brennan Motors and Walsh Restaurant Group were ringing nonstop with angry customers demanding answers. Richard and David's comfortable lives were about to be turned upside down, and they had no idea how much worse it was going to get. The revenge was just beginning. By the time Teresa finally boarded her flight 3 hours later, the video had been viewed over 10 million times. The hashtag Justice for Teresa was trending nationwide, and Richard Brennan's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. Teresa settled into her seat, the uniform carefully placed in her carry-on bag. The Marines had escorted her through security and made sure she was safely on her plane before the media circus could follow her. Colonel Harrison had given her his card and promised to check on her when she got home. "The whole country is watching now," he had told her before she left. "Your husband's story is being told, and people are listening." Meanwhile, back at Brennan Motors, Richard's world was crumbling. His phone showed 847 missed calls and over 3,000 text messages. His business email was flooded with angry messages from customers canceling their orders and demanding refunds. His secretary, Janet, met him at the door with a stack of papers and a worried expression. "Mr. Brennan, we have problems. Big problems." She led him into his office, where 3 televisions were showing different news channels, all covering the same story. His face filled the screens, frozen in the moment when he was holding Teresa's husband's uniform. "Channel 7 has been running the story every 15 minutes, Janet explained. "Channel 12 did a special report on Gold Star families, and Fox News wants to interview you, but I told them you weren't available." Richard slumped into his chair, watching himself on television. The man on screen looked like a monster, laughing at a widow's belongings, treating her like garbage. He barely recognized himself. "What about sales?" he asked weakly. Janet's face said everything. "We've had over 200 people call to cancel their orders. The bank called 3 times about our loans. And—" She hesitated. "Your wife called. She's flying back from her sister's house. She saw the video." Richard felt his stomach drop. Margaret had been visiting her sister in California for 2 weeks. She had no idea what had happened, but she would soon. His phone buzzed with a text from her. "We need to talk. Now." Across town, David Walsh was facing his own nightmare. His restaurant empire, built over 15 years, was falling apart in a single afternoon. Walsh Restaurant Group employed over 300 people across 5 locations, and now all of them were at risk. His general manager, Kevin, called an emergency meeting. "The protesters started at the downtown location around noon," he reported. "They're carrying signs with pictures of Sergeant Williams and chanting for justice." The lunch crowd turned around and left. David looked at the security footage from his restaurants. Crowds of people stood outside each location, many of them wearing military uniforms or carrying American flags. They weren't violent or destructive. They were simply making their presence known. "What about reservations?" David asked. "Cancelled," Kevin replied. "All of them. We have 0 reservations for tonight across all 5 locations." The phone system crashed from all the calls. David's phone rang. It was his lawyer, Patricia Chin. "David, I've been watching the news. We need to talk immediately. This is bigger than just bad publicity." "What do you mean?" David asked. "The video shows you participating in what could be considered harassment of a military family. There are federal laws about this. We could be looking at civil rights violations, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and possibly hate crime charges." David felt the room spin around him. "Hate crime? We didn't know she was military." "That doesn't matter," Patricia explained. "You targeted her because you thought she was beneath you. The video shows clear discrimination, and now it's a national story." As the afternoon wore on, the story grew bigger. Social media influencers were sharing the video, adding their own commentary about respect and dignity. Veterans groups were organizing boycotts. Military families were telling their own stories of sacrifice and service. Teresa's flight landed in Denver at 6 p.m., and she was surprised to find reporters waiting at the gate. Airport security quickly moved her to a private exit, but the story had followed her home. Her small apartment in the quiet neighborhood of Maple Grove had news vans parked outside. Neighbors she barely knew were standing on their porches, watching the commotion. Mrs. Patterson from next door waved at her with tears in her eyes. "We saw the video, honey," she called out. "We're all so proud of you." Inside her apartment, Teresa finally allowed herself to cry. She sat on her couch, holding Michael's uniform, and let 6 months of grief pour out of her. The day had been overwhelming, but for the first time since his death, she felt like his sacrifice was being recognized. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, but she ignored them all. She just wanted to be alone with her memories and her grief. At 8 p.m., the local news ran an extended segment about Sergeant Michael Williams. They interviewed his commanding officer, his fellow soldiers, and members of the community where he had grown up. The picture that emerged was of a dedicated soldier, a loving husband, and a man who had died protecting his fellow troops. "Sergeant Williams was the kind of soldier every commander wants," said Colonel Patricia Martinez, who had served with him in Afghanistan. "He was brave, dedicated, and always put others before himself. His widow deserves nothing but respect and honor." The segment ended with a photo of Michael and Teresa on their wedding day, both of them smiling and full of hope for the future they would never get to share. By 9 p.m., Richard Brennan's car dealership had lost over 400 customers. His suppliers were calling to ask if the contracts were still valid. His employees were worried about their jobs. The business he had built over 15 years was crumbling in less than 12 hours. His wife, Margaret, confronted him when he finally came home. "How could you do this?" she asked, her voice shaking with anger and embarrassment. "How could you treat a military widow like that?" Richard had no answers. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to understand how he had become the villain in a story that was now being told around the world. David Walsh's restaurants remained empty through the dinner rush. His staff stood around with nothing to do, while protesters maintained their vigil outside. The financial losses were mounting by the hour, but the real reckoning was still to come. As Teresa finally fell asleep that night, clutching her husband's uniform, she had no idea that her story had reached the highest levels of government. The president had been briefed on the situation. The Secretary of Defense had issued a statement. And tomorrow, the full weight of a nation's anger would come crashing down on the two men who had made the mistake of thinking they were more important than a gold star wife. The revenge was about to reach its peak, and Richard and David were about to learn that some mistakes can never be forgiven. Teresa woke up to find her phone buzzing with a call from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Mrs. Williams? This is Amanda Foster from the White House. The president would like to speak with you." Teresa sat up in bed. Sure, she was still dreaming. "I'm sorry, what?" "The president saw your story on the news last night. He'd like to invite you to Washington to honor your husband's service. Would you be available next week?" While Teresa tried to process this surreal conversation, Richard Brennan was discovering that his nightmare was far from over. He arrived at his dealership to find it surrounded by hundreds of protesters, many wearing military uniforms. Veterans from 3 different wars stood shoulder to shoulder, their message clear. Disrespect one military family and you disrespect them all. But the protesters weren't just outside. Richard's own employees had called in sick or simply quit. His service department was empty. His showroom was silent. The American flags that had once proudly decorated his lot now seemed to mock him. His phone rang. It was his bank. "Mr. Brennan, we need to discuss your loans immediately. Given the current situation, we're concerned about your ability to meet your obligations." Richard's hands shook as he realized what this meant. Without bank support, his business couldn't survive. The loans that had helped him expand were now weapons that could destroy everything he had built. "Please," he begged, "this will blow over. People will forget." "Sir, you're trending on social media worldwide. This isn't going away." Across town, David Walsh was facing similar devastation. His 5 restaurants sat empty, while his competitors were packed with customers who had actively chosen to boycott his establishments. His staff was reporting for work with no customers to serve. But the final blow came when his largest supplier called. "David, we're terminating our contract effective immediately. We can't be associated with your business right now." Without suppliers, David couldn't serve food. Without food, he couldn't run restaurants. His empire was collapsing one phone call at a time. Meanwhile, Teresa's story was inspiring something beautiful across the country. Veterans groups were organizing fundraisers in her honor. Military families were sharing their own stories of sacrifice. Schools were teaching children about the importance of treating everyone with respect. A GoFundMe page created by strangers had raised over $500,000 for Teresa in just 2 days. People from all over the world were donating money and leaving messages of support. "Your husband died for our freedom," one message read. You deserve all the respect in the world. Thank you for your sacrifice, another said. Military families are heroes too. Teresa felt overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. After months of feeling invisible and forgotten, she was reminded that good people still existed in the world. The president's call came that afternoon. Teresa sat in her small apartment, holding her husband's uniform, as the most powerful person in the country spoke directly to her. Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that your husband's sacrifice will never be forgotten. And I want you to know that every American stands with you today. Thank you, Mr. President, Teresa whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm also calling to let you know that we're creating a new initiative to support Gold Star families. We're calling it the Michael Williams Foundation in honor of your husband. Will you help us launch it? Teresa could barely speak. Michael's name would live on, helping other military families who had paid the ultimate price for their country's freedom. While Teresa was being honored at the highest levels of government, Richard and David were discovering that their actions had consequences they never imagined. Richard's wife, Margaret, had filed for divorce. I can't be married to someone who would treat a grieving widow like that, she told him. This isn't the man I married. His children were being bullied at school. His friends were avoiding him. His country club had revoked his membership. The comfortable life he had built was crumbling around him. David's situation was even worse. His restaurant group had officially filed for bankruptcy. 300 employees had lost their jobs because of his actions. The man who had once been proud of creating jobs was now responsible for destroying them. But the most powerful moment came when Teresa finally decided to speak publicly. She held a press conference outside the VA hospital where Michael had once been treated for his injuries. My husband died believing that America was worth dying for, she said, her voice clear and strong. He believed that we were a country where everyone deserved respect, where kindness mattered more than money, where doing right was more important than being right. The crowd of reporters and supporters hung on every word. What happened to me at that airport wasn't about me, she continued. It was about who we are as a people. Do we judge others by their clothes, their bank accounts, their zip codes? Or do we see the humanity in everyone we meet? She held up Michael's uniform, the same one that had been scattered across the airport floor just days before. This uniform represents sacrifice. It represents service. It represents love of country. But it also represents a choice we all have to make every day. We can choose to be kind, or we can choose to be cruel. We can choose to lift others up, or we can choose to tear them down. The cameras captured every moment as Teresa folded the uniform carefully, the way Michael had taught her years ago. I forgive the men who humiliated me, she said, surprising everyone. I forgive them because that's what Michael would have wanted. He would have wanted me to show them the same kindness and respect that they failed to show me. The crowd erupted in applause, but Teresa wasn't finished. But forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. Their actions showed the world who they really are, and now they have to live with that truth every day. As Teresa walked away from the podium, Richard Brennan sat in his empty car dealership watching her speech on his phone. For the first time, he truly understood what he had done. He had attacked a woman who had already sacrificed everything for her country. He had mocked the belongings of someone who had lost the most important person in her life. The revenge was complete, but it wasn't the revenge of anger or hatred. It was the revenge of truth, of consequence, of a world that had finally seen clearly who these men really were. Teresa Williams had won not through cruelty, but through dignity, not through revenge, but through grace. And in doing so, she had honored her husband's memory in the most powerful way possible. The story ended not with destruction, but with hope. Hope that people could learn to be better. Hope that kindness would always triumph over cruelty. Hope that the sacrifice of heroes like Sergeant Michael Williams would never be forgotten. Teresa returned to her quiet life, but she was no longer invisible. She was a symbol of strength, of grace under pressure, of the truth that every person deserves respect regardless of their appearance or circumstances. And somewhere, in a place beyond understanding, Michael Williams was proud of the woman he had married, the woman who had honored his memory not with anger, but with the same love and dignity that had made him a hero. The lesson was clear. Treat everyone with kindness, because you never know whose sacred story you might be holding in your hands.